Thank you for joining our webinar, Forecasting and Planning to Optimize Performance. Brought to you by Bill, a leading financial operations platform for small and mid-sized businesses. As a champion of SMBs, we are automating the future of finance so businesses can thrive. Our integrated platform helps businesses to more efficiently control payables, receivables, and spend and expense management. Hundreds of thousands of businesses rely on Bill. And what do they rely on Bill for? They rely on Bill to more efficiently control payables, receivables, and spend and expense management. They also rely on Bill's proprietary member network of millions to pay or get paid faster. Headquartered in San Jose, California, Bill is a trusted partner of leading U.S. financial institutions, accounting firms, and accounting software providers. And we invite you to visit Bill.com for more information after our webinar. I'm Joe Fleischer. I am thrilled to serve as your moderator during our webinar. We are going to talk about financial planning and analysis. That is a framework for establishing best practices in forecasting and planning. We'll also talk about what finance leaders can do to plan and forecast effectively. In particular, we're going to talk about drivers and scenario planning. Drivers and scenarios have become essential for forecasting and planning with regard to the overarching discipline of financial planning and analysis. We'll also highlight how finance leaders can apply advances in automation to improve forecasting and planning. I am thrilled that my colleague Rami Assad, Senior Vice President of Product Management, is joining us. Rami is exceptionally knowledgeable about financial planning and analysis. I'd like to begin by introducing the term, if the term is new to you. And Rami, I would welcome your perspective. What is financial planning and analysis for those who are not familiar with the concept?
FP&A is simply the way of taking the analysis of the past and figuring out what the financial outcomes of the future should look like. Really, I think of FP&A as telling the narrative of what the business has done and what the business is going to do through numbers. It should be aligned with the same narrative that the CEO tells employees or tells investors. It should be aligned with the strategic direction of the business, but it should be told through the lens of spreadsheets and numbers as opposed to slides and a story.
Now that's a really great point. Now, the great thing about financial planning and analysis, as we'll acknowledge, is with scenarios, for example, we do have a way to establish, let's say, a narrative or a possible narrative, and then translate that to quantities, let's say. So with that in mind, before we pose our first polling question, I just want to give you a moment to perhaps tee up the concept of scenarios and drivers. These are especially scenarios, these are narratives, but the great thing about scenarios is we can translate them to numbers. And the same is true with drivers. We're going to define drivers in more detail later, but what can you tell us, sort of as a kind of teaser, Rami, regarding scenarios and drivers and how they inform financial planning and analysis?
Yeah, so drivers are really the key mechanisms that help no pun intended here, drive the business, that help really make, when pulled on or pushed on, they make material changes to the outcomes of the business. And scenarios are what are the different likelihoods or the different options that might exist in how those drivers might perform. If for example, sales is you want to understand what drives your sales, and you want to say, what if sales comes in low or what if sales comes in high? And so you start planning for the future for all possible outcomes of what the future might hold, as opposed to being headstrong in one specific direction.
Absolutely. We're going to elaborate on that. One thing I do want to add, organizationally, financial planning and analysis is often under the office of the CFO. It is a very high-level role and often a very visible role within an organization. Now, Before we explore drivers, scenarios, and other aspects of financial planning and analysis in more detail, do want to pose our very first of 4 polling questions. We want to find out whether you agree or the extent to which you agree with the statement that your organization needs to improve the accuracy of its financial forecast. What we can already see is more than 4 out of 5 respondents indicating that organizations need to improve the accuracy of financial forecasts. Not necessarily surprising, because forecasting is a science. It's also an art. And we talk about art, I think that's where narratives come in. The narratives actually help to improve the analysis and vice versa.
I'd love to throw a little quote from the past here at this. There's a famous British statistician. His name is George P. Box, and he used to say, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." And the thing that I know everybody wants that perfect model that's always accurate. My background before coming to Bill, before being SVP of product here at Bill, is that I ran a number of small businesses. I started and sold a number of companies. And so for 20 years, I've been running companies, and my models were never right. Sometimes I overshot and did better than I expected. Sometimes I did worse than I expected. My third company that Bill acquired was a financial planning and modeling company. That's where my expertise comes into this. And what I can tell you is handedly, if you nail your model exactly right, consider yourself lucky. Right? But the whole point of it is to be able to construct your model in a way that it's a constantly living, adapting piece of machinery that can help guide your future decisions. It's not about it being right. It's about it helping you inform what you should be doing towards the future or how you should adapt in the future. So while it's great to have a model that hits it on the nail, it's more important that the model can help you adapt as different scenarios come about in the future.
That's a really important point. I just want to add that we're talking about attendees' perceptions. And I think there are 2 aspects of this. So one aspect is 4 out of 5 respondents to this poll indicating that they perceive that they need to improve the accuracy of their financial forecasts. What we're going to reveal, as you very astutely pointed out, Rami, is that maybe that's not the goal. Maybe it's a matter of being able to factor in different possibilities, different scenarios, and be aware of the underlying drivers so that an organization is able to adapt as conditions change. Because to your point, accuracy presumes that there's only one direction things can happen and that there's a target to hit. And in reality, life is not like that. And so with that in mind, what I'd like to do now is launch into our discussion. Love to hear your perspective on, first of all, why FP&A. And I think you've already, before I turn the floor back to you, Rami, I think you've already established a very strong argument for FP&A is conceptual. It's getting us out of the mindset, rigid mindset of accuracy and considering other aspects, drivers, scenarios, and to your point, adaptability as well. So why should organizations establish the discipline of FP&A?
Well, the FP&A function is really about helping you think through what the future might bring in the case that the future is not the same trend or same on the same line as the past or the current state of the business, right? If you have a really steady state business that's cash flow positive and it's growing at a very consistent rate, it has no seasonality to it, and there's not much changing, I would argue you don't really need FP&A. But FP&A comes in handy when you think about any kind of future changes that might happen, whether that's changes in the business itself, like changes in leadership, or that's changes in the macro environment, like market conditions changing, or if you're growing very rapidly and reinvesting into that growth, at some point that growth might asymptote, right? And so if it's not a steady state number, if that number is changing, you want to be able to understand that growth and be able to adapt to the various cycles of it. Sometimes leaning into it, sometimes pulling back. And so all of those different kinds of conditions really call for an FP&A function to help you think through how to adapt.
That's a wonderful point, and let's explore this further. Um, Now, organizations, when they forecast and they establish goals, it's not just about hitting a number; it's goals in terms of the capabilities of an organization. So, I want to give you the opportunity, Rami, to elaborate on that.
Yeah, FP&A has really two functions. The first is a reporting and analysis function, right? The A in FP&A is analysis, and so it's really about understanding the current state of the business, monitoring the performance, reporting on the business, understanding exactly what's going on today, because that's what's going to inform the future. And the second function of FP&A is the planning, right? And so that is around the business planning, around how you're going to allocate resources to achieve your financial goals. So those two things really go hand in hand, and they actually kind of feed into each other.
Let's consider what contributes to planning. And Rami, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You could go very deep. If you've looked at some of the financial models that get built out, they could be dozens of tabs deep and very, very complicated. But at the bare minimum, you want to understand your headcount, current and future plans, right? You, for most businesses, makes up about 50 to 70% of your costs, right? In the other pieces that you want to think about your revenues, right? Your revenues is what's driving your growth. It's what is the output of your drivers. You want to understand those two things. Those seem pretty standard, and it may feel a little redundant to say them out loud, or a little reductive here. But the next two, I think sometimes I've seen people forget, and it's really important not to. The first of the two being the cash flows of the business. Oftentimes, people, when things are going well, they just say, "Hey, revenue's going great. We see, the bookings growing. We know we have, everything is up to the right. Let's just go." And they may not think as deeply about the cash flows, and they might find themselves in a cash crunch. In fact, I put this bullet on there because I've felt this pain firsthand. While the company was growing, our AR collectibles, our DSO started really stretching out, and our customers paid us annually. And so we had to do a better job of managing cash flow, even though revenue was growing. And we experienced the cash crunch as a business and had to take some pretty aggressive actions to mitigate running out of money, even though the company was growing. And so this was a personal passion of mine, because I felt that pain personally in running one of my businesses. Keep track of your cash flow, keep track of your receivables, and what your liabilities are month to month, even if things are going well. The other thing that people sometimes forget are the KPIs, and the KPIs are snapshots of what's going well and what's not. This is to serve as the early indicators that a trend is changing. This is going to help you day in and day out, month in and month out, really understand, hey, something's not blinking yellow. Let's investigate before you get to red. And so if you have the right KPIs in place, you'll have more time to adapt to changing dynamics in your business, and be able to either right the ship or make adjustments in how you run the business, whether it's from a spend perspective or future plan perspective. The KPIs are the first indicators that something is not going to plan.
And KPIs referring, of course, to key performance indicators. So I want to perhaps summarize where we've arrived so far. We've talked about what organizations can do by introducing the discipline of financial planning and analysis. I'd like to consider now what's happening in financial planning and analysis. And actually, these are long-term, long-running trends, if you will. I'd like to give you a moment, Rami, to talk about some of the key aspects of financial planning and analysis, some of which we alluded to earlier and which we'll talk about in more detail soon. What would you say are some key ongoing developments with regard to financial planning and analysis?
Well, so we've talked a little bit at the beginning, and I think it very much warranted to reinforce scenario planning or what if modeling is one of the most important things that you can do as a business. So instead of building one financial model that says this is the predicted outcome, this is the hopeful outcome, what I recommend most people do is they start with that, and then from there take the upside, create the outer bounds of what the upside and the downside scenarios might look like. Oftentimes, what if modeling doesn't necessarily go as far as predicting a pandemic. I don't think anybody in 2020 had in their financial model COVID hitting, right? So it's not black swan events, but it is what if things happen twice as slow as we thought they would? What if sales are half as good as we thought they would be? What if this launch takes twice as long for us to get it out the door? Those types of scenarios will help you adapt to the changing business as you see things on the ground. And the reason I say you want to create the upper and lower bounds, it's so that you kind of have three models, right? If you have your main model right here and your upper and lower bound right here, as your main model shifts, you already know what the drivers are and what the drivers should look like in the upper bound or in the lower bound. So you can just start tuning them somewhere in between there, right? And so that's the other bullet on here that I think is really, really important, is understanding really what are the knobs that you can turn in your business? What are the cranks that drive your business? And how can you change those based off of what performance or what outcomes you expect to have? These should be actionable. All your drivers should be actionable. You should be able to manipulate them by either. Oftentimes, it's using money, right? It's they're really derivatives of things that you can buy or spend money on to drive the business. But these things are oftentimes drivers to revenue, but they could also, but that could also then drive other things. One example that people often forget is that what happens when you get a bunch of customers? Well, does that mean that your support costs or your shipping costs go up as well, right? And so that's a case where the number of customers or the amount of revenue that you have end up driving something else. So you could have drivers that drive something, and then that could in itself drive something else, right? And so that creates a very dynamic model. When one number changes, it could ripple through the model. And the whole point of all of this is to really get out ahead of what the future might look like. But as the future starts materializing, be able to adapt to what the analysis on the ground looks like.
Thank you, Rami. I'd like to talk about best practices in forecasting and planning. And as we consider forecasting and planning, what forecasting and planning and pretty much all of finance have in common is data, raw data, sometimes unstructured data. So I want to hear your thoughts about data and what one does with it first of all, looking at how organizations finance teams have worked with data in the past and how their approaches are evolving as they introduce the discipline of financial planning and analysis.
Well, if anybody's kept up with the modern AI wave, they've heard or they know that data is the modern day equivalent of gold. Really, data drives. The more data that you have, the more that you can drive more accurate responses, more accurate information, a better outlook, right? And so you want to make sure that you have a holistic view of your business consolidated into one central pool, one central place. In the past, all of our data lived in a bunch of different silos, and we had to download them, and it was a very manual effort in terms of bringing all of that data together. You would download them into different spreadsheets and then clobber them together with a bunch of merges to be able to get a really good historical look of what happened in the past. And oftentimes that was so tedious that that's as far as most FP&A functions went. Really, it became a reporting function on what happened in the past. 70 to 90% of people's time was spent in putting together the historical data into a concise story. We have much better tools nowadays that can automate pulling all of this data together. If you haven't automated getting your data into one place, this is your reminder that that's the most important first step. You want to be spending less than 10% of your time putting the data together, another 20, 30% of your time reviewing the past data, and you want to spend the majority of your time thinking about the future. That's where you're going to derive the most value out of your FP&A function. And so making sure that you have the right tooling, making sure that you have the right data sources, and making sure that you have the right automations in place to pull data together is really, really critical.
It's an essential starting point, and we can't take it for granted, and especially at a time when the term and concept artificial intelligence is taken center stage. I think understanding what one does with data and how one applies it and shares it is valuable, because now we're going to consider another implication of that. Now, data management is a whole topic in itself. There are risks inherent with any kind of planning, with any kind of forecasting. And part of that is building risk management into forecasting and planning. Love to hear your thoughts about that, especially in relation to scenario planning.
Yeah, that's a great way of framing it. In terms of risk management, as a way of thinking about scenario planning, right? And that really phrase there that's in quotes is really the key phrase. What if? What if this happens? What if that happens? And it's not always bad. I mean, and, as I've been describing scenarios, I've been describing a lot of negative scenarios, but you could have a really positive scenario. What if sales are twice as good as we thought they would be? Well, how do we lean into that? Does that mean that we would want to hire twice as many sales reps because we're so much more efficient? Is there more room for us to grow? Right. And so these what ifs aren't necessarily bad, but you want to be able to think about different situations that might come up and understand what would happen, what would happen if those situations do come to arise.
Exactly. And I would add that just as finance executives work with colleagues who manage data, if there is a role such as a chief data officer, if there's a role such as a chief risk officer, data risk management, these are organizations or experts within an organization who need to partner with finance executives. The next consideration is drivers. And here we have the metaphor of the train. Want to hear your thoughts about drivers, because we talked about scenarios providing a narrative. Drivers perhaps provide, let's say, if not the foundation, the columns that support the building. Let's say. I want to hear your thoughts about drivers and how one thinks of them when forecasting and planning.
Yeah, I think describing it as a foundation is a really great point here, Joe. You want to be able to put the right number of pillars up, but not too many that it actually takes away all the usable space of the building, right? And so you could have too many or too few. You really want to find that Goldilocks number of drivers. And the way that I think about it is, if something is a material number, if moving this number up or down creates a material change in the outcomes, whether that's in the cash position of the company, whether that's in the revenue, whether that's in in the number of customers, whatever it might be, if moving this number across different scenarios, across a bad scenario and across a positive scenario, has a multiple percent impact on the business, then I would consider it a pretty good driver to have. If it's not, then you don't necessarily need to get into the weeds of this driver. I've seen people get so pedantic with tying every single software license to every single employee and being very pedantic about saying who needs a Slack license, who doesn't, who needs a Microsoft Office license and who doesn't, and it can get a little tedious, and you kind of lose the forest for the trees here if you pick too many drivers. And so if you as you look at your different scenarios, if the outcomes of the business don't move materially, then I would argue that it's not an important driver that you need to focus on. It's always great to have as dynamic of a model as possible, but the key drivers should fit on a separate sheet. You should be able to point to, anywhere from 4 to no more than, I would say, 20 key drivers that you're going to manipulate to say, here's what's going to drive the future. And don't let great be the enemy of good. Another really key thing that I've seen people do is they get overly worried about getting the numbers exactly right on what that driver is. Remember, most models are wrong, right? But they're useful. So if you don't know exactly what this number is going to be, that's fine. Set it, review it the next month, and see how far off were you. But the key thing here, remember that quote, some models are useful. The key way to make it useful is for you to be able to understand why is that number wrong, right? Whether it was better or worse than you thought the outcome was going to be. Do you have the right driver in place that you understand what happened in the past month or in the past quarter, in the past year, that led to the number not being as good? Let's say sales come in under what you expected. Why? Was it because you didn't hire the number of salespeople that you thought you would? Was it because your salespeople weren't as productive? They didn't hit the quotas that you thought they would? Was it because they didn't have the right number of leads that then converted into it? Why did you not hit your sales numbers? Not because sales were slow, but you got to be able to explain the why and then course correct the business to adjust for either that being the new normal or saying, here's how we're going to rectify this issue that we had before, right? So it's not enough to say, here's what we think our revenue is going to be. You want to be able to know why we hit our number, missed our number, and what can we do to adjust it for the future.
Exactly. And to I just want to follow up on 2 points you made. Yes. Great should never be the enemy of good, because often the goal is to accomplish something, and if great prevents one from accomplishing something, then there is no such thing as great. So that's one thing. Also, establishing limits, if you will, on the number of drivers, or at least not thinking about quantity as being an indication of quality when considering drivers. Sometimes fewer drivers are more, are actually more useful than more drivers. And then finally, to your point as well, that when we think about drivers, that we are to follow up on an earlier point, that again, the goal is not accuracy. The goal is to make us better, ensure we're better able to adapt. That said, than we would be without being able to think in the context of drivers and scenarios. That said, there is certainly chronological consideration here, and I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that, both with regard to developing forecasts, and then, of course, being able to apply them and enable an organization to adapt based on the information it has.
Well, so there's a number of key points in terms of how you think about the time scale and the frequency that you put out a forecast. The first bit being that how far out you forecast is really a function of your business. If you are tight on cash and your cash flows are really kind of close and narrow, and you are running a let's say a cash-based business, not a investor-based business where you have investors that continue to pour money in, then you might bring your forecast all the way down to a 13-week forecast, right? That 13-week forecast is really focused on the cash flows of the business and making sure you don't run out of money, that you can always make payroll, and that's the core focus of that. Now, if you're running a little bit longer term of a business, if you are raising capital, for example, and have a startup, a venture-backed startup, then you might extend that forecast to a 12 to 24-month forecast. Anything past that for you might feel just like guessing at that point. And you want to be able to say, here's what we're going to do next year, and that's what you're telling your investors. And then every 3 to 6 months, sometimes every month, you might then update that forecast. And we'll get to that in a second in terms of rolling forecast. You could be potentially a nonprofit. I have seen some nonprofits where it's a very membership-based nonprofit that's based off of a specific geography. Let's say you have dentists in a region, and that's the nonprofit that you run, or the association that you run. At that point, you might do a 10-year forecast to be able to forecast out what the growth of that region might look like in terms of the number of dentists, the number of members, and you want to be thinking much, much longer term. It really depends on your business and where you are as a business. In any of those scenarios, what I recommend is that it's a rolling forecast. And this comes into how often you update it, but how often you reforecast it. Month in and month out. Or if it's a 13-week forecast, and week in and week out, all right. And if it's a 10-year forecast, year in and year out, right? So about 1/10 of the period, plus or minus, you want to update your model and say, here's what the actuals were relative to what we said was going to happen. That's just updating the model and saying, hey, here's what the actuals are. Let's analyze that versus what we forecasted or what we budgeted. Now, that's the first step. That helps you understand what went right and what went wrong. The next step, the more advanced version of that, is then reforecasting and saying, based off of the new information, here's what we think the next 12 months will look like again. And you constantly are reforecasting. You don't change your budget, but you change the forecast to the new information around what's going on. I like to rebudget. If, let's say, I have a 12-month forecast, I actually do tend to rebudget every 6 months. I don't wait till the entire period goes out, but I do continue to create a rolling forecast that changes what I think the numbers are going to come out to based off of the information that I'm getting, because that helps me continue to learn and refine my assumptions.
Exactly. And the ability to revise and the willingness to be open to revising assumptions based on, let's say, new information, and applying the discipline of financial planning and analysis such that one can look at rolling forecasts. One has a structure in place for rolling forecasts. I think all of those are crucial considerations. What we want to do now is pose our second polling question. And what we want to do is find out the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement that your organization requires additional training, resources, and tools to prepare actionable financial forecasts and plans. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. More than 7 out of 10 respondents at the very least agree that they do require additional training, resources, and tools in order to prepare actionable financial forecasts.
I'd be remiss if I didn't give a call out to our great partners at Build. We heavily work with some of the best accounting firms in the country, and there's this trend in accounting now called in outsourced firms called client advisory services, right? CAS. And you'll find that most of the major accounting firms have a CAS practice. Even if you have your own bookkeeper, if you feel like you don't have the expertise in-house to do this, this is a great thing to start with an outsourced accounting firm that can bring that expertise and consult with you on how to build your initial model. They could help you build it in a way that you could update it pretty regularly, and then you can consult with them every 3, 6, 12 months and continue to refine your model until you get that muscle built up internally. So if you feel like you don't have the expertise, this is a great thing to outsource. If you have an account manager at Bill, please ask them, because we work with some of the greatest accounting firms and we'd be happy to make recommendations for you.
Really great point, Rami, and great reminder that our attendees are not alone. Let's talk briefly now about the financial planning cycle.
The first part is anticipate, right? The future plan. You put your plan in to get in at the beginning. Then you're going to measure how did we come in as the time goes on? How did we do against what we thought we were going to do? The key point from there is not just to say, okay, well, that's what happened. You want to be able to refine your plan and adapt what you do to in the future plans. And so you continue to do this ongoing cycle every period as you update your model, and that's how you get the full utility out of a financial model. You want to continue to reforecast, you want to continue to measure and see how good or bad you did at guessing what the future might bring, and then refine your plans and adapt what you do in your drivers to hopefully anticipate a closer outcome in the future.
Exactly. And it is a cycle, and one does learn over time. And it's a continuous process of continuous improvement. Now, I want to just briefly talk about some other aspects of financial planning and analysis, skills and capabilities.
The key narrative here is that you may not feel like you have the skill set, and it may be very well true. If you have an accounting function in your business today, that may not be the right skill set to actually do FP&A. In the U.S., unlike abroad, you actually find that FP&A and accounting are all under the same function, and they really try to create this dual understanding of the business. We actually break it out into the U.S. And FP&A really is its own function. You find many CFOs either come out from the accounting side or come in from the FP&A side, and it's almost a different type of brain. You need a different skill set. You need to be able to story tell. You want to be thinking more about the strategic aspects of the business and less about the tactical nature of what's going in and the rule-based approach that you tend to take with accounting. That's not to say that an accountant can't do FP&A or vice versa. There's definitely that overlap where they both have to be very, very data driven. They both have to be very good with numbers, but you find that it slightly diverges. I tend to find that FP&A people come from an MBA background, whereas I find that most of the accounting people come from an accounting background. It's almost a different discipline altogether. And one of the key things that really comes into play that people underestimate the value of is the storytelling aspect. It's how to weave the story of what the business is doing into those numbers, or be able to articulate what the numbers are saying into a story. That helps capture the rest of the business. That helps explain what's going on, because sometimes the cells start to feeling overwhelming for the non-finance people when you hand them a spreadsheet and say, hey, well, here's what's going to happen in the business. That might feel a little intimidating or overwhelming, and you want to bring as many people in to the financial model as possible, and that storytelling is the way that you do it.
And storytelling, Rami, is a social endeavor, and I think we should talk a little bit more about social aspects of FP&A.
Absolutely agree. I mean, this is the model, the inputs and the outputs of the financial model should be a social endeavor. You want to figure out, you want to make sure that people have an opportunity to weigh in on the drivers that the specific function is going to be responsible for, so they have buy-in, right? Oftentimes, I see a lot of companies do just a top-down model where they say, "Here's the goals that we're expected to hit, and here's the budget, and now go hit it." And the individual contributors or the department heads look at it and say, "Well, God, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that." And they start the process, they start the year demotivated because it almost feels unattainable. And so what I always recommend is both put a tops down model, but also get a bottoms up model, right? Create the outputs that you want, and then give it back to your department heads, and then tell them what resources would you need to be able to deliver these outputs. And then you go back and forth and you continue to refine the tops down and the bottoms up model until they converge somewhere in the middle where everybody feels good about where you're going and how you're going to get there. Similarly, you want to hold people accountable after the fact. When they say, "Here's what I'm going to do," you want to be able to come back to them and say, "Well, you said you were going to do this, but you did this instead. What happened?" Right? You want to be able to hold them accountable for hitting their goals, for hitting to maintaining their budgets, and be able to refine the future goals of the model based off of what they tell you on why they did or didn't do the things that they said they were going to do, right? And so it's not just about creating the model, it's about being able to hold people responsible and accountable for where they say they're going to take the business.
Exactly, because if we're going to engage in a social endeavor, there has to be accountability. Earlier, Rami, you shared a very apt quote: "All models are wrong, some models are useful." And with that in mind, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how organizations can go about sharing models that underlie their planning and forecasting.
Well, models have very sensitive information, and it has people's salaries, it has future revenues of the company that you may not feel comfortable sharing broadly. So oftentimes people create this walled garden, and they say, "Hey, nobody can come in and look at this model." Tooling has made it a lot easier for us now to be able to share bits and pieces of the model. And if you don't have the right tooling in place, and you want to create the right structures where you can export different parts of the model to be able to create the collaboration that you want, right? And so even if you're doing it in Excel, set things up in individual sheets so that you can export each individual budget and the actuals separately. Right. And so if you want to send the BVA, the budget versus actuals, out, then break it out. Each sheet should have its own department head, and then it should be rolled up into another sheet. That way you can just simply export one sheet at a time and send out the budget versus actuals. You want to be able to have a KPI dashboard that everybody can see. I would recommend a KPI dashboard that can go as far as each individual contributor in the company, to the extent that you can. If you're a publicly traded company and you can't share everything out, even at Bill, the KPIs that we have, we say we're red, yellow, or green on KPIs, and we share that with employees so that they get a sense of what's driving our business and how we're performing as a business without sharing material non-public information. But the key thing here is that you want to create transparency all the way down to the individual contributors so that they understand what are the most important things in your business and how is the business doing and what's driving the business. All of those things are really, really critical to making sure that everybody in the organization is aligned towards where you want to go.
Exactly, exactly. And I appreciate your acknowledging that what comprises a model, the detailed information may not be what you want to share, but you certainly want to share goals and outcomes. I'd like to pose our third of four polling questions we want attendees to do, and you can select multiple choices in this case. You can select all that apply. Which of the following does your organization consider when preparing forecasts and plans? You can select all that apply. And what am I referring to? From top to bottom, the choices are drivers, scenarios, organizational benchmarks, previous financial results or other. Keep in mind, percentages will exceed 100% because attendees can select more than one choice in response to this question. Drivers and previous financial results appear to be in the lead. Scenarios are definitely not too far behind, and certainly benchmarks are key as well. I'd like to continue our discussion. What aspects of financial planning and analysis lend themselves to automation?
You should start with data collection, right? Automate getting all of the data into one place. What that can then do is automate spitting out reports about what's going on. If your data is collected automatically, then at certain periods you can click a button or just update things, and you can get the financial reports that you're expecting in an automated fashion. And then if you have those two things automated, the next most important thing that you want to keep as real time as possible is dashboards of those key performance indicators, those KPIs.
When we talk about software and automation, what are some things to keep in mind with regard to applying automation to financial planning and analysis?
Well, the way that you want to think about it is anything that you do as a process, either month end or quarter end, or to prepare for certain meetings, you want to think about that process and say, if I'm doing this manually, can this be automated? In this day and age, the answer is probably yes, right? If it's not thinking about something, if it's data collection, data aggregation, data presentation, any of those types of things as a process can likely be automated, right? And so you want to think about to the steps to automate that is to think about, how do I go about doing this? What data do I get? From what areas, right? You create a workflow, and then you look for tools to automate that workflow, or you look for new software that can integrate into those tools. And so a big part of this is, how do you get all of your systems integrated together into a centralized source? Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, in this day and age, you could very quickly get a little you could get ahead of yourself here and try to use a plugin or plug data in very, very quickly. Just double check around the data security and privacy of the tools that you're using to pull this all together. And the reason I say that, I'll give one key example. In the modern day of ChatGPT and these AI tools, there's a really big famous example where a bunch of people at Samsung were using ChatGPT, and they didn't realize that the data that they had put into ChatGPT, they didn't have the right privacy in place, and that data was re-ingested into the algorithm. And then anybody else that queried that, the ChatGPT about Samsung's specific business was told specific non-public information that the people at Samsung had used, right? So it's really important in this day and age where everything is a SaaS tool, everything is learning from all the data that it's ingesting, that you look at the privacy and data security of the tools that you're using.
Yeah, we cannot take that for granted, especially because we may not always be aware of the unintended consequences of information that we've shared internally and where that may go externally. It also ties into risk management and scenario planning. What can finance leaders do as a result of automating some aspects of financial planning and analysis?
So the more that you automate, the more that you shift you as a financial leader from being a reporting and budgeting person to being a strategic partner for the business, right? And it's shifting from tactical to strategic. It is what I expect out of my CFOs. It is what you become the right-hand person of your CFO. The more that you can automate the data gathering, the reporting, the more time and bandwidth you have to be the storyteller, to talk through strategic decisions, and be able to be that strategic partner to the function and business leaders that you work with.
Exactly. And before we wrap up, what do you want attendees to remember from this webinar? What are key takeaways?
Well, again, you remember FP&A is about analyzing the past so that you can plan better for the future. The more you automate, the more that you can take care of the past understanding and reporting, and really focus on analyzing and planning. That's where the true value of FP&A comes from. And you don't need your plan to be exactly accurate. You just want to find the right drivers that help you find utility and make your plan useful, so that you can plan better as the future comes to reality.
Wonderful summary. What I would like to do now is pose our last polling question to attendees. Within what time frame, if any, does your organization intend to apply advances in automation to improve financial planning and forecasting? I really appreciate, Rami, your sharing your expertise. I want to thank attendees for joining our webinar, Forecasting and Planning to Optimize Performance.